Hi, my name is Trent Tynert. I'm the Texas Parks and Wildlife Biologist for Guadalupe and Gonzales counties. And I'm going to be talking to you about the wildlife management practices overview and then start off on the habitat management wildlife practice. So on your wildlife tax valuation wildlife management plan, you'll see that there are 7 main categories of wildlife management, and they are habitat management, erosion control, predator control, providing supplemental water, providing supplemental food, providing supplemental shelter, and performing census counts and surveys. You have to do 3 out of these 7 every year to qualify for your plan. And you might notice that you have several practices that might fall under one category. But the nice thing about this plan is that it's very flexible, and a lot of times there are overlapping practices in these different categories. So if you find that you're doing 2 or 3 things in one category, look around in other categories and you can probably find a way to move 1 or 2 things to a different category and spread out the practices that you're doing. Of course, it's a minimum of 3 practices, but I recommend that you do 4 to 5 practices. That way, if you find that you're doing something that did not work, then you can fall back on one of your other practices and it gives you a cushion. That being said, I would not check every box on the plan because it's going to be really hard to follow through if you check too many practices on the plan. So I recommend just getting 4 to 5, a couple extra practices. Keep in mind every one of these practices has a minimum amount of effort that you have to put forth to qualify. For example, habitat management sections might require you to have 10% or 10 acres complete. And then things like erosion control might give you credit for 10 years. So some of those practices would give you 10 years worth of credit towards your plan, and the rest of that 10 years you only have to do 2 practices. Things like supplemental shelter might tell you you have to put a minimum of a certain number of bluebird boxes out or owl boxes. So make sure you check those minimums. And each one of those minimums comes off of the guidelines on the Texas Parks and Wildlife webpage. They're based by ecoregion. So you want to make sure you're finding the correct ecoregion that you're in and looking at the guidelines for your ecoregion to make sure you meet those requirements. So right now we're going to go through all of these different categories and discuss various practices in each category. You'll notice there might be dozens of practices in each category that are available to you. Please note the practices that you like and hone your list of practices and narrow them down so we can discuss them with you. You'll also receive written information to help you implement these selected practices. And hopefully at the end we'll get a breakout section where you'll get to spend some time talking to a biologist and asking them questions about your specific practice that you have. So habitat management or habitat control is the first category on your wildlife management plan. And so we're going to start with that. So under this, the first option is grazing management. So this could be things like resting your property for 1 or more years, changing it to rotational grazing system, implementing a different type of grazing system. And the goal would be to rebuild vegetation, maintain grass density, increase plant diversity and grass diversity on your property. Some considerations you have to think about are secondary uses, if you have to supplement your property income with grazing and maintain a certain grazing level, can you implement this? Will it work for you? And then also think about the various grazing systems out there and which ones are the most applicable to your property and to your needs. So your next option we have is prescribed burning. You can use this with or without grazing. Some of the benefits are you're removing old dead thatch, you're stimulating plant growth, and you're managing grass and brush with fire. Some considerations are you have to think about planning and safety. We used to think that fire was our best tool and we could implement it at anywhere we could and it would do nothing but improve the habitat. Now with some of the exotic invasive grasses we have, we take a pause a lot of times and make sure that that property is ready to implement fire. Sometimes if you implement fire in the wrong conditions, you'll actually see exotic invasive grasses spread across a property. So we want to make sure that the property is ready for fire. We also want to think about the minimums that you have to do every year in the different ecoregions of the state. So for instance, 3%, you have to do 3% of your total property in South Texas and 15% in the Edwards Plateau, Blackland Prairies, and Post Oak Savanna in Texas. So think about those minimums, and they will vary depending on where you're at in the state. Another option is range enhancement or reseeding, and typically the goal here is to reseed with native plants, and you want to provide food and cover for wildlife where it didn't exist prior. Some considerations would be it typically can be expensive. It might be over $150 per acre. That can be quite expensive, and that's going to cover preparations and planting only. And typically you have to do 10% or 10 acres annually, whichever is less, to qualify for this practice. So the next thing we have is brush and tree management. This is something everybody should be doing on their property if they're not already, because plants are continually growing, succession is continually happening, new plants are sprouting, and so this is a continual process that everybody should be doing on their property. And you can do this to maintain invading brush such as mesquite, juniper, yaupon, and the goal is to promote a balance of brush, grasses, and forbs, and you want to shape the brush and habitat to suit the wildlife needs. So you're trying to provide the right plant species composition and structure for those wildlife needs. To do that, you can use mechanical treatments that range from anything from a chainsaw to a bulldozer, anything in between, or chemical means. Typically, we recommend individual plant treatment, which would minimize the amount of application of herbicide on the landscape, or in some instances there might be cases where you might want a boom sprayer to use a larger application. With this practice, you can also promote new plant growth or plant seedlings or trees. So this is a very flexible practice. You can take away brush and trees, or you can add plants as well. Some considerations are, this isn't just a one-time fix. Once you start, you can't stop. You always need to do some type of brush management. Over time, that amount of effort will become less, but it is a continual process. To qualify this, you need to do 10% of your designated area, or 10 acres, whichever is less. And if you're going to do the tree planting, you're going to have to do 150 trees or shrubs planted per acre. That's a very high rate, so a lot of people probably aren't wanting to plant at that high of a rate, but that is the requirement. So our next thing is fence modification. So generally this refers to net wire fences, and net wire fences pose a problem to wildlife because a lot of times they block natural wildlife movements across the landscape, and they also create areas where predators can trap wildlife against fences or in fence corners and allow for a higher mortality rate than would be natural. So to change this or to improve upon it, you can modify these fences by folding over the top portions of the fence or folding up the bottom portions of the fence. If you can't do it on the whole fence, you can do it on select areas to help improve wildlife movement across the landscape. I've also seen people build different structures that have natural breaks in the fence or allow wildlife to cross at certain man-made structures in certain ways. So some of these can also count toward your fence modification practice. Next is riparian management and enhancement. So the goal of this is to prevent erosion and protect important habitats such as areas along creeks, rivers, streams, areas like that. And some techniques you can use are fencing, and then deferring grazing off of those areas, and establishing vegetation that helps stabilize the banks and prevent erosion along those stream sides. These practices are good for 10 years, so this is one of those practices where if you implement a big project like this, you will get credit for the next 10 years and only have to implement 2 practices for the next 10 years of your plan. And next we have wetland enhancement. This is creating habitat for water-dependent species. Some of the techniques you can use are creating wetlands or managing existing wetlands, and you can exclude cattle from them so they're not grazing in the wetlands. You can provide water. You can plant or promote native plant growth, and this is also a 10-year practice. Next, we have habitat protection for species of concern. So this is any habitat management practice or activity that benefits a species of concern, such as a Texas horned lizard, gold-cheeked warbler, black-cap vireo, threatened or endangered species most of the time. And some techniques could be fencing out exotic species, brush management, regulated grazing. Really, this is kind of a structured approach for a specific species. And you must have this species of concern on your property. And these practices are typically strictly geared to managing that species. So a lot of times you're working with a state agency already and implementing these practices already, but you can get credit for that on the tax plan if you're doing these practices. And this is also a 10-year practice. Prescribed control of native, exotic, or feral species. I can't think of any plant or animal that doesn't fit into one of these categories. So this is a very broad category, and a lot of times you'll find overlap here in other categories on this plan. So starting off with vegetation, you could be trying to control Bermuda grass, juniper, mesquite, and you would need to do 10% of the designated acre on your plan, or 10 acres annually, whichever is smaller. And you could also manage to control animals such as feral pigs, exotic deer, or more animals like mentioned in the predator control section. So you'll see a lot of the things in the predator control section would also overlap here. So if you have another predator control practice that you're doing, maybe you can put one of your other predator control practices here. Or if you're already doing, say, brush management, then you could put the feral pig control under predator management. So this is a pretty flexible section of the plan right here. So the last one I have for you is wildlife restoration. Typically, you're restoring a native species to an area, and you're restoring habitat to suit that animal that's being reintroduced. And also then you're reintroducing and managing that animal. This doesn't fit very many people's situations in Texas. Most of the time, if you're claiming this practice, you're going to be working with a state agency reintroducing something like turkeys or some wildlife species to your property. And those occasions are typically rare. But if you happen to be working with us on one of these projects, you can claim that on this wildlife tax valuation plan. And with that, we're going to have our next presenter,